to your heroes backstage and receiving not even a nod in return. Eddie felt that Perry saw him as a threat. An upstart from California who was rewriting rules that the previous generation had spent years establishing. They wouldn't go out of their way to help anybody, he said, 'cause they would feel threatened. Perry came from a school built on riff-heavy grooves and raw attitude, thick, swampy blues rock that defined the early 1970s. Eddie's playing, by contrast, was lightning in stereo. Two-hand tapping, harmonic dives, obsessive tone shaping. It sounded futuristic, almost alien, to some veterans. It didn't feel like evolution. It felt like an invasion. Privately, the snub stung. But Eddie wasn't wired for grudges. "I don't give a fuck if I'm playing a Holiday Inn lounge," he once said. "I enjoy playing." He played for the sheer joy of creation, not politics, not approval. If others couldn't see that, it was their loss. Ironically, time vindicated him completely. In 2013, Perry looked back with open admiration. Eddie's playing was just phenomenal. He took everything he'd heard and put his own stamp on it. I thought, oh my God, this is great. He reinvented guitar playing. That recognition came late, but it spoke volumes about how impossible it eventually became to deny what Eddie had done. The tension with Tom Scholz of Boston started with a bizarre incident during a shared bill in the late 1970s. Van Halen had just finished their set, Eddie's solo still ringing in the crowd's ears, when Scholz took the stage and, right in front of the same audience, played Eddie's solo back to them. I was standing on stage, and the whole crowd was looking at me like, "What's this guy doing?" Eddie recalled. "I was drunk. I got pissed." The image stuck with him, made sharper by the fact that Scholz was never particularly warm backstage. He never comes around, he doesn't say hi, doesn't do anything, Eddie said. Just kind of hides out, runs on stage and plays, and disappears afterwards. The combination of imitation and aloofness felt like arrogance. In reality, Scholz couldn't have been more different from Eddie, an MIT-trained mechanical engineer. He had built Boston's debut album in his basement, constructed his own recording gear, and developed a Rockman amp system that helped define arena rock's polished sound. Where Eddie played by raw instinct, Scholz calibrated by science. One lived for improvisation, the other trusted formulas. To Eddie, the issue was originality, something he considered almost sacred. He had built his Frankenstrap by hand, soldering pickups and blowing up amps until he found his own voice. Seeing someone mirror that sound felt like watching a stranger wear your face. "There's a difference between inspiration and duplication," he said years later. "You can be inspired by someone's playing, that's how we all start. But if you don't evolve, you're just tracing someone else's shadow." Still, mutual respect eventually emerged. Scholz admitted Eddie had genuine imagination. You can't teach that, and Eddie returned a compliment. "The guy built half the stuff he used. That's cool. I respect anyone who gets their hands dirty." If Tom Scholz was frustrating, Rick Derringer was a genuine wound. Because Derringer was someone they had grown up admiring, a veteran with real history and real credibility. In 1978, Derringer opened for Van Halen on tour. After one show, Eddie walked into the bar, still buzzing with adrenaline, found Derringer, and said plainly, "Hey, Rick, I grew up on your ass. How can you do this? I don't care if you use the technique. Don't play my melody." He wasn't angry about the tapping technique itself. He was furious that Derringer had copied his solo note for note, melody for melody, in front of the same audience that had just watched Eddie perform it. The next night, Derringer did again. Same notes, same phrasing, and closed the set with "You Really Got Me," a song Van Halen had already made their own. Eddie's patience ran out. He told Derringer straight, "If you keep doing that, you're off this tour." And just like that, Derringer was gone. For Eddie, this was about identity, not ego. Van Halen was still carving its place in history, and his sound was the heart of it. "It's fucked, you know," he later admitted, "because I copied some of his chops way back then." The sting wasn't imitation itself. It was watching a hero cross the line between homage and theft. His father, jazz musician Jan Van Halen, had taught him early, if you play someone else's song, make it your own. Derringer hadn't done that. Years on, Eddie could laugh about it. "I was a kid, And I'd worked so hard for that sound, he said. And then you hear someone just rip it off on stage? You go, no way. Derringer never denied the story. When asked about Eddie, he simply called him a monster player. Nobody can touch him. Maybe that was his way of making peace. The most complicated relationship of all was the one with Randy Rhoads, because it was never really hatred. It was something far more tangled: admiration, competition, wounded pride, and a rivalry frozen forever in time by tragedy. In the early 1980s, Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads stood at the center of rock's guitar storm, both young, both revolutionary, both endlessly compared. He revolutionized the electric guitar, inspired millions of players, and redefined what rock music could sound like. Yet behind Eddie Van Halen's infectious grin and mind-bending solos lay a tangle of rivalries that few fans ever fully understood. These weren't tabloid feuds or manufactured controversies. They were the complicated, deeply human consequences of being a visionary in a world full of other visionaries. 6 guitars shaped Eddie's inner life in ways that range from heartbreak to outright fury. Here is the full story. Before Eruption, before the screaming crowds, before any of it, a teenage Eddie Van Halen sat in his Pasadena bedroom with a cheap guitar and a worn stack of Cream records, dropping the needle on Crossroads night after night, trying to capture every bend and fiery lick that Eric Clapton coaxed from his Les Paul. Clapton wasn't just an influence. He was the reason Eddie picked up a guitar at all. Clapton was my main influence, Eddie told Guitar World. I used to sit there for hours trying to figure out what he was doing. I'd play that solo on Crossroads, note for note. He was God to me. In those years, Eddie didn't care about fame or money. He wanted to understand what made Clapton's playing feel so breathtakingly alive. The phrasing, the sustain, the perfectly placed silences. Time, of course, changes everything. By the late 1970s, Eddie had done something even Clapton hadn't. He reinvented the electric guitar from scratch. When Eruption detonated on the airwaves in 1978, it sounded like it came from another world entirely. His two-handed tapping, harmonic squeals, and whammy bar dive bombs redefined what the instrument was capable of. The shy kid from Pasadena had become the future of rock. Not everyone was cheering. In 1980, when Clapton was asked about Van Halen, his response stunned Eddie. He's very good technically, Clapton said, but I don't hear much soul. It was a casual remark, the kind tossed off without much thought, but it cut straight to the bone. For Eddie, it was devastating. The man who had shaped his entire musical identity had dismissed his work as mechanical. Years later, he admitted, "It kind of broke my heart. I learned everything from him. I wasn't trying to outplay him. I was inspired by him. To hear that he didn't like what I was doing really got to me." He never fired back publicly. He never insulted Clapton in interviews. But friends said he quietly wrestled with the disappointment, unable to shake how strange it felt to be rejected by his own hero. Part of the clash was philosophical. Clapton's blues-rooted style depended on restraint and phrasing, while Eddie's was built on freedom, distortion, and fearless experimentation. In a sense, they represented two different eras of rock. Clapton the sound of the 1960s, Eddie the sound of the future. The admiration, though, never truly faded. Clapton's tone on Crossroads, that's still untouchable, Eddie said in 1995. That's pure feeling. You can't fake that. When the two eventually met in Los Angeles in the mid-1980s, Eddie was nervous and hopeful, like a fan meeting his idol. Clapton was polite but distant. Afterward, Eddie told a friend, "He's just a man. I think I love the myth more than the person." By the end, he had made his peace. "If Clapton hadn't existed, neither would I," he said. Whatever he thinks of me doesn't change that. For a teenage Eddie Van Halen, Ritchie Blackmore wasn't just another rock star. He was a prophet of tone. Eddie studied Byrne and Highway Star note for note, replaying them until his fingers bled, marveling at the precision of Blackmore's solos, the biter's distortion, and that haunting sense of drama hanging over every riff. When Van Halen's debut album exploded in 1978, Eddie suddenly found himself standing alongside the men he had idolized. He was no longer a kid with a Strat copy in his bedroom. He was a peer, a chart-topping guitarist rewriting the rules of rock. And then came the moment he finally met one of his gods. It was nothing. Blackmore just stared at him. Wouldn't say hello. Nothing. I was crushed, Eddie recalled in a 1982 Guitar Player interview. I thought, wow, I looked up to this guy my whole life, and he just blew me off. Years later, still stung, he described how both Blackmore and Joe Perry had given him a shaft with their eyes, a phrase that perfectly captured the chill, the blank dismissal, the total absence of connection from the men whose posters had once hung on his wall. When Blackmore was eventually asked what he thought of Van Halen, the response felt like a compliment wrapped in a jab. He's a fine player, but I think he plays too many notes. Fans argued over that line for years. In truth, it revealed a genuine philosophical divide. Blackmore's style was shaped by classical phrasing and deliberate restraint. Eddie's was fluid, explosive, and gloriously unbound. Where Ritchie crafted control, Eddie embodied freedom. It wasn't quite a feud, more a generational standoff between two different schools of guitar playing. And yet Eddie never let it curdle into bitterness. I was probably just too sensitive back then, he reflected in 1995. Maybe he was shy or didn't know what to say. But man, I worshiped that guy growing up. Still do. Over time, even Blackmore softened, eventually acknowledging that Eddie found his own voice, recognition that arrived late but still arrived. The cold indifference wasn't limited to Blackmore. When Van Halen hit the road in 1978, Eddie found himself repeatedly brushed off by players he'd grown up revering, and Joe Perry of Aerosmith was chief among them. People like Joe Perry would just give me the shaft with their eyes, Eddie recalled. Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. No, nothing. I'm not that way. Imagine being a young prodigy playing with everything you have every single night, then bumping in